The Kalen Academy of Galactic Studies was one of the most prestigious institutions in the galaxy. It accepted students from hundreds of species, providing them with unparalleled education in diplomacy, survival, and interspecies relations. One of its most demanding programs was the Off-World Survival course, a mandatory second-year requirement designed to test adaptability in unpredictable environments. This year's location, Viraxis 4. Viraxis 4 was a mostly uncharted planet with dense jungles, extreme weather, and an ecosystem teetering on the edge of being classified as high risk. The Academy's assessment labeled it as challenging but manageable. To the students, it was a nerve-wracking experience. To the human participants, it was just another Tuesday. Yevon, a Lernian with pale bioluminescent skin and 4 reflective eyes, adjusted the straps of his environmental suit as he walked with his group toward their designated campsite. The air on Viraxis 4 contained trace toxins not deadly, but unpleasant for many species. Lernians, lacking strong immune systems, required filtered masks for prolonged exposure. Beside him, Daniel Carter, the only human in their survival group, carried his pack over one shoulder, walking with the ease of someone strolling through a park. Unlike most of the students who had varying forms of protective gear, he wore nothing beyond standard Academy-issue fatigues. No breathing mask, no exosuit, no reinforced plating. Yevon glanced at him. "You do realize the instructor said this planet is considered semi-hostile?" Daniel grinned. "Yeah, and you're walking around like we're on a resort moon." Daniel gave a small shrug. "It's a jungle, sure, but it's not the worst place I've been. Air's breathable, gravity's fine, and there aren't any giant acid-spitting insects trying to eat us." Yevon's upper eyes blinked in sequence, his equivalent of a skeptical frown. "That is a very specific example." "Yeah, because that was my last field assignment," Daniel replied, stretching his arms. "Compared to that, this is paradise." Yevon shook his head. Humans were baffling. They lacked natural armor, had soft, easily damaged skin, and broke their bones with alarming ease. Yet somehow they thrived in conditions that would send other species into shock. The group of 8 students trudged through the underbrush, guided by Academy instructors. The camp was already set up ahead, nestled between towering trees with thick, bioluminescent vines draped over the branches. The Academy staff had established a perimeter with sensor beacons and portable barricades, complete with watchtowers and an armored transport station nearby. The instructors, a mix of hardened alien soldiers and experienced survivalists, were already setting up defensive points. While this was technically a controlled environment, no one underestimated the dangers of Viraxis 4. The planet was mostly mapped, but occasional predator sightings kept everyone on edge. Once the students arrived, Instructor Relmar, a broad-shouldered Varan with rough, plated skin, addressed them. His deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "The next 7 days will test your ability to survive in an unfamiliar environment," he stated. "You will construct shelters, forage, and work as a team to maintain camp operations. You will not wander beyond the perimeter without authorization. Viraxis 4 is largely unexplored. We do not know what lurks beyond these jungles." A few students exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel simply nodded. "Got it." Relmar's sharp gaze landed on him. "I assume you have experience in survival scenarios." Some, Daniel admitted, shifting his pack. "More military training than wilderness survival, but same principles." Relmar grunted, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Then use that training to assist your group." Dismissed. The students dispersed to begin setting up their individual shelters. Yevon worked alongside Daniel, though most of the heavy lifting fell on the human. "You are unusually strong for a species with no exoskeleton," Yevon observed as Daniel drove a stake into the ground with his bare hands. Daniel smirked. "Thanks. Gravity on my homeworld is higher than standard, so we build muscle density pretty easily." Yevon processed that. "I suppose that explains why your kind compensates for its fragility with endurance." Daniel's expression flickered with amusement. "You really think we're that fragile, huh?" Yevon's lower eyes blinked. "I know you are. Your bones break from simple falls. You lack protective plating. Your internal organs are poorly shielded." He gestured at Daniel's exposed arms. You don't even have fur or scales to provide insulation. Daniel chuckled, driving another stake into the dirt. Fair enough, but we make up for it in other ways. Like what? Daniel leaned on his knee, tilting his head slightly. You'll see. That response did nothing to ease Yevon's skepticism. As night fell, the students gathered around the fire pit for their evening briefing. The jungle surrounding them pulsed with alien life, distant calls of unknown creatures, the rustling of unseen movements in the trees, the glow of luminescent fungi scattered along the forest floor. Instructor Relmar stood near the edge of the firelight, arms crossed. The region remained stable, no recorded threats. However, sensor readings indicate movement beyond our mapped territory. We are increasing night patrols as a precaution. A small ripple of unease moved through the students. Yevon turned to Daniel. Are you still not worried? Daniel took a bite of his ration bar, chewing thoughtfully before answering. Nope. Yevon exhaled in frustration. How are you like this? Daniel grinned. You're overthinking it. If something does happen, panicking won't help. Yevon's lower arms twitched, a sign of irritation. That's not logical. Daniel finished his food and stretched. Look, if something dangerous shows up, we'll deal with it. Simple as that. Yevon muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue further. As the night deepened, the jungle noises began to fade. The usual sounds of chittering insects and distant animal calls grew strangely muted. Even the wind through the trees seemed to quiet. Yevon felt a small, creeping unease settle in his chest. He wasn't sure why. And for the first time, Daniel's relaxed demeanor didn't seem as reassuring. Something was wrong. Yevon couldn't place it at first, but the more he listened, the more certain he became. The jungle had gone silent. He had spent enough time studying alien ecosystems to recognize the pattern. When a region's natural sounds suddenly ceased, it almost always meant one thing: a predator was near. From the way the instructors were shifting, he wasn't the only one who noticed. Instructor Relmar stood near the fire, his posture subtly tense. He scanned the darkness beyond the perimeter lights, fingers resting near the hilt of his plasma blade. The other instructors followed suit. Their casual stance from earlier was gone, replaced by a slow, methodical readiness. Yevon turned toward Daniel, who was watching the tree line with an unsettling intensity. His body was still, his expression unreadable, but something about him had changed. His usual easygoing demeanor had vanished. You feel it too, Yevon murmured. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Yevon shifted his weight. I don't understand. You're a human. You shouldn't be able to sense threats like this. Daniel's eyes didn't leave the trees. I don't sense it. I know it. A chill ran through Yevon. How? Daniel exhaled slowly. Back home, if you're out in the wild and everything goes quiet, it means you're being hunted. A moment passed. Yevon wasn't sure why, but something about the way Daniel said those words unsettled him more than the silence itself. Before Yevon could question him further, a low, chittering growl rippled through the jungle. Not close. Not yet, but moving closer. The instructors reacted instantly. Weapons were drawn. Defensive positions taken. The students who had only moments ago been chatting near the fire suddenly felt the weight of real danger pressing in on them. Relmar's voice was sharp. Everyone, inside the shelters. Now. No one argued. The students scrambled, some bolting toward the reinforced storage units, others toward the armored transport. Daniel didn't move. Yevon grabbed his arm. What are you doing? Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder. I just want to see what we're dealing with. Yevon's voice sharpened. Are all humans this reckless? Daniel glanced at him. You wanted to know how we survived despite being fragile? Pay attention. Yevon opened his mouth to argue, but then the first shape moved at the edge of the floodlights. It was massive. The Varkul were larger than he expected. He had read about them in the Academy database, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. They stood on two digitigrade legs, their their elongated heads tilted slightly downward, as if forever locked in a hunting posture. Their armor-plated hides gleamed in the artificial light, segmented and overlapping, allowing for speed and flexibility. Their multi-lensed eyes reflected the glow like molten amber. They weren't charging. Not yet. They were testing the perimeter, calculating, watching. A second creature moved to the left, then a third. The instructors were already in position, plasma weapons aimed, but they hadn't fired. Not yet. Relmar's voice was low, measured. "Hold your fire." Yevon's heart pounded against his ribs. His lower arms clenched. Then the largest of the Varkul let out a deep, resonating growl. It wasn't a random sound. It was a signal. The Varkul charged. The instructors opened fire. Plasma bolts ripped through the air, striking the lead creature's armored plates. Blue energy crackled against its thick hide, but the beast didn't stop. It barreled forward, its claws carving deep furrows into the dirt. The camp erupted into chaos. Students ran for cover. The transport's automated turrets activated, sending high-impact rounds into the attackers. Instructors held their ground, firing in controlled bursts. One of the smaller Varkul broke through the defensive line. It moved faster than Yevon expected. 1 second it was beyond the barricades. The next it was inside the camp, weaving through crates, dodging weapons fire with unnatural agility. It was heading straight for the nearest group of students. Yevon saw it happening. He saw the Zilthari student frozen in its path, too slow to react. He saw the beast's claws rise, ready to strike. And then Daniel was there. He moved differently from the others. While most species reacted by fleeing or freezing, Daniel charged toward the Varkul. Before the creature could reach the student, Daniel swung the butt of his rifle against the side of its head. Hard. The impact was enough to stagger the beast. Just for a second. A second was all Daniel needed. He fired point blank into the creature's exposed side. 3 sharp cracks, not plasma, kinetic rounds. The Varkul shrieked, recoiling from the unexpected force. The bullets didn't pierce its armor, but the sheer impact was enough to throw it off balance. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pivoted, grabbing the terrified student and shoving them toward cover. Move. Yevon stood frozen. He had never seen anyone move like that. Another Varkul leapt over the barricade. Daniel turned too late. The creature swiped at him, claws catching his side. A sharp, wet tear filled the air. Daniel staggered. Blood sprayed onto the dirt. Yevon gasped. That was it. That was a fatal wound. Humans were not built to withstand that kind of damage. Daniel should have fallen. He should have gone into shock. Instead, Daniel gritted his teeth and shot the creature in the throat. The kinetic round slammed into a weaker point between its plates. The Varkul screeched, stumbling backward. Daniel staggered, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. But he didn't fall. He reloaded. Yevon's brain refused to process what he was seeing. Daniel was injured. His body was torn open. Blood loss alone should have rendered him incapacitated, but he was still standing, still moving, still fighting. Yevon had spent years studying physiology. He knew what should be possible. He knew what should have ended a human in mere moments. Daniel Carter was breaking every rule. And for the first time, Yevon wasn't sure if humans were fragile at all. The jungle was alive with chaos. Plasma fire streaked through the darkness, flashing blue and white as it impacted against the Varkul's armor-plated bodies. The shrieks of wounded beasts mixed with the sharp commands of the instructors as they fought to hold the defensive line. But Yevon could only focus on one thing. Daniel was still standing, still fighting. Blood seeped from the gash in his side, darkening his academy-issued fatigues. The wound was deep, torn by razor-sharp claws meant to disembowel. Any other species would be on the ground, writhing in pain or already unconscious from shock. Daniel? He reloaded his rifle with steady hands. Yevon watched in stunned disbelief as the human exhaled sharply, adjusted his stance, and fired 3 more kinetic rounds into the nearest Varkul. The creature recoiled at the impact. It wasn't a kill shot, their armor was too thick, but it hurt them. That alone was impressive. Plasma weapons were the standard for most galactic species, designed to burn through defenses. But kinetic rounds? They bludgeoned their targets. Daniel was using sheer force to batter the creatures down. It was brutal, inefficient, and yet it was working. Yevon started to move toward him, but something big slammed into the ground between them. Another Varkul. The impact sent Yevon sprawling backward, his 4 eyes widening in panic. The creature's mandibles clicked as it turned its multi-lensed gaze toward him. Yevon had no weapons, no combat training, no chance. He braced for the inevitable. And then Daniel tackled the damn thing. A human. A species with no claws, no natural armor, no built-in weaponry, threw himself onto a predator twice his size. The Varkul shrieked, twisting violently as Daniel latched onto its back, his arm hooked around its throat in a desperate attempt to choke it out. Yevon could hardly comprehend what he was seeing. Daniel should not have been able to move like this, not with the amount of blood he was losing. But there he was, bleeding, bruised, teeth clenched in raw defiance, fighting like he had no idea he was supposed to be dead already. The Varkul thrashed, slamming into the ground in an attempt to throw him off. Daniel held on. He reached for his belt, yanked free his combat knife, and drove it straight into the beast's exposed throat joint. The Varkul convulsed. Then it stopped moving. Daniel rolled off its back, hitting the dirt hard. He let out a sharp, ragged breath, his body trembling from the effort. Yevon scrambled forward. "Daniel, you need medical." Daniel forced himself onto one knee, gripping his knife with bloody fingers. His breathing was unsteady, but he was still preparing to fight. Yevon grabbed his arm. "Stop. You're going to die if you keep this up." Daniel let out a strained laugh. "Not if we win first." Yevon wanted to scream. How was this even possible? Daniel shouldn't be able to function like this. His body was failing, it had to be. Blood loss, adrenaline crash, pain beyond what any normal being could withstand. And yet, he kept getting up. Something primal stirred in Yevon's mind, an understanding he had never considered before. Humans weren't built to survive like other species. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the fastest. They weren't even the most durable. But they were something else entirely. They were creatures who refused to fall. A terrible, eerie screech rang through the jungle. The remaining Varkul hesitated. Their multi-lensed eyes flicked between their fallen kin and the blood-soaked human still standing in the dirt. They were reconsidering. And for the first time, Yevon saw something he never thought he'd see in a predator species. Fear. They were afraid of him. Daniel exhaled, tightening his grip on his blade. His voice came out hoarse, exhausted, but unwavering. "Go on." Then he bared his teeth in a sharp grin. "Try me." The Varkul turned and vanished into the trees. They ran. For a long, breathless moment, there was only silence. Then, "Instructors, report." Relmar's voice broke through the comms. "Status check. 5 students injured but stable," one of the guards called. "Minor casualties among staff. Area secure for now?" Yevon barely processed any of it. He was still staring at Daniel, who had just made an apex predator retreat by sheer force of will alone. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From realization. Everything he thought he knew about humans, about their fragility, had been wrong. Daniel wobbled on his feet. His adrenaline was fading. His body was finally catching up to the damage. Yevon surged forward just in time to catch him as he collapsed. "Got you," Yevon muttered. His heart was still hammering in his chest. Daniel let out a rough laugh. "Told you. We get by." Yevon swallowed hard. He didn't understand humans at all. But one thing was clear. They were anything but fragile. The adrenaline was fading. Yevon could feel it in the air, the way the chaos of battle gave way to something quieter, heavier. The instructors were regrouping, checking injuries, stabilizing the wounded. The defensive perimeter, once teetering on the brink of collapse, was slowly being re-established. But none of that mattered right now. Because Daniel was dying in Yevon's arms. His breathing was uneven, his body trembling with the effort of just staying conscious. Blood loss had turned his skin a shade too pale, his fatigue soaked through with deep red. The gash in his side was no longer bleeding freely, it was clotting in thick, dark patches, a sign that his body was running out of resources to keep up with the damage. And yet, Daniel still tried to push himself up. Yevon gritted his teeth. Stop. Moving. Daniel coughed a wet, awful sound. Good. Yevon almost wanted to shake him. You're going to die, and you're worried about whether we won. Daniel exhaled sharply, the ghost of a laugh escaping his lips, just making sure. Wasn't for nothing. It wasn't. The Varkul were gone. The students were alive. Even the injured instructors were stable. The camp, though damaged, still stood. And yet Yevon's 4 eyes flickered over Daniel's wrecked body, and all he could think about was how absurdly wrong he had been. Because humans weren't fragile. They weren't weak. They were terrifying. A species that bled so easily and still stood back up. A species that, when faced with an overwhelming predator, attacked first. A species that could lose so much blood and still be asking if they had won. The realization settled in Yevon's chest like a stone. Daniel Carter should not have survived this. No one should have survived this. But somehow he had. And Yevon couldn't look at him the same way ever again. A sharp voice cut through the air. Medics. Medics. Instructor Relmar appeared at their side, dropping to one knee beside Daniel. His reptilian gaze flicked over the human's injuries, his expression unreadable. You held the line, Relmar said simply. Daniel let out a tired chuckle. Did my best. Relmar didn't respond right away. Then, without warning, he reached out and clapped a hand against Daniel's shoulder firm, solid. A gesture of respect. Rest now, human, he said. You've earned it. Daniel finally let himself slump against Yevon's side, his body going slack as unconsciousness took him. Medics rushed in. Yevon barely registered their voices, barely noticed as they began applying wound seals and transfusion packs. His mind was still racing. Even unconscious, Daniel's expression wasn't peaceful. It was defiant. Even now, his body refused to accept defeat. Later. The camp had been relocated to a safer position deeper in the jungle, reinforced with additional security measures. Emergency beacons had been sent out, and an extraction team was en route. Yevon sat beside Daniel's cot in the medical tent, watching the human sleep. Daniel's injuries had been stabilized, he would live. But the fact that he had survived it all still didn't make sense. Yevon had spent his whole life studying biological sciences. He knew how bodies worked, how shock and trauma affected the nervous system, what pain thresholds were supposed to look like. But Daniel had rewritten all of that in a single night. A groggy voice broke the silence. You're staring. Yevon jolted slightly as Daniel's eyes cracked open. His voice was hoarse, his movements slow, but there was a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Yevon narrowed his eyes. You should be dead. Daniel gave a lazy shrug. Guess I'm bad at dying. Yevon exhaled sharply. That's not an answer. Daniel turned his head slightly to look at him. You want to know how? Yevon nodded once. Yes. Daniel hummed. All right, he shifted slightly in his cot, wincing as he adjusted his position. Here's the thing about humans. We don't have natural weapons. No claws, no armor, no poison. We get sick easily, we break easily, and compared to a lot of species, yeah, we're kind of fragile. Yevon frowned. Then how? But Daniel interrupted. his smirk fading slightly. What we do have is a body that won't quit even when it should. Yevon stiffened. Daniel continued. Pain doesn't stop us. Injury doesn't stop us. Even when everything in our body is screaming at us to shut down, we can keep moving. He tilted his head slightly. You ever hear of soldiers fighting with broken bones? People running for miles on torn ligaments? Survivors holding on in conditions that should be impossible. Yevon swallowed. Yes, but... That's humans. Daniel's voice was quiet now. We don't stop. Not until we have to. A cold realization settled in Yevon's mind. Daniel hadn't just been fighting that night. He had been dying, and his body had refused to let him feel it until the battle was already over. Humans weren't stronger than other species. They were worse. They were things that kept going long after logic dictated they should have fallen. Yevon exhaled slowly, his mind spinning. You're insane. Daniel chuckled weakly. Nah, just human. Yevon stared at him for a long moment. Then without a word he stood up and left the tent. He needed time to process this. But deep in his chest he knew one thing for certain. The rest of the galaxy had no idea what kind of monsters they were dealing with.